All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Doug Hamans. I'm the chair for the Scienids Management Board, and I'll call this board to order. Taking a quick look at the agenda. You've had a chance to review the agenda. Are there any additions to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll consider it approved by consent. Next, we'll ask for any public comment on items or topics that are not on the agenda. Is there anyone in the audience with comment? Anyone in the online world? No one in the Ethernet. So with that, we shall move right into the business of the day, which is consideration of the 2024 Red Drum Benchmark Stock Assessment and Peer Review. And with that, I'll hand it over to the esteemed Dr. Bellinger.
All right, thanks guys for having me here today and giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that we've been doing for the last several years regarding the Red Drum Stock Assessment. All right, sorry, trying to make sure the clicker's working here. So before I get started, I just want to point out that this project, it represents the hard work from both the ASMSC Red Drum Stock Assessment Subcommittee and the ASMSC Red Drum Technical Committee, with the names of those currently serving on the committee shown here. So as well, no surprise to this board, I think it's important to go ahead and remind folks that red drum fisheries along the Atlantic coast are primarily recreational in nature, being exclusively so since the mid-1980s for the southern population, and with a greater than 90% of annual removals occurring via recreational fisheries for the northern population in recent years. So red drum had a relatively long assessment history along the Atlantic coast. Click forward. With early assessments using forward projecting virtual population analyses. Before transitioning, let's click, to a custom statistical catch at age model starting with CDAR 18 in 2019. From here, the analysts in CDAR 44 attempted to transition to using an integrated age structured model formulated in the stock synthesis framework, though ultimately this model was not accepted for management use. And instead, we sort of reverted back, the CDAR 44 Stock Assessment Subcommittee reverted back and updated the SCA used during CDAR 18 and the ASMFC 2017 report. I'll also just point out that we transitioned from assessing the Atlantic Coast red drum as a unit stock along the Atlantic coast to a southern and northern stock beginning with Vaughan 1996. This stock definition does persist through today's assessment as well. The results of the most recent ASMFC assessment suggested neither stock was experiencing overfishing in the terminal year of the assessment, which was 2013. However, this assessment could not determine an overfish status based on SSB, given the use of an age 7+ group in the model, which resulted in a large amount of adult cryptic biomass that cannot be tracked, making estimates of SSB changes through time unreliable. Despite the models being accepted for management use, there was a high degree of uncertainty regarding fishing mortality and spawning potential ratios in the terminal year of that assessment, making determination of overfishing status highly uncertain. Further, the models relied on some heavily and highly influential external data analyses and had other significant criticisms identified during the peer reviews of CDAR 44 and ASMFC 2017. To prepare ourselves for the current benchmark, we conducted a simulation assessment to evaluate the performance of different models with regards to determining stock status, including biomass levels, using 3 different modeling frameworks: model-free stock indicators, which would be analogous to a traffic light analysis approach we'll show a little bit later on; a juvenile population dynamics model, which was analogous to the custom statistical catch at age used during ASMFC 2017; and then an integrated stock population dynamics model, which is analogous to the model we're going to be showing from the stock synthesis, the primary results we're going to be focusing on today, at least for the southern stock. These results underwent independent peer review, with the most pertinent final recommendations being not continuing pursuit of the custom statistical catch at age model, which was used in CDAR 18 at ASMFC 2017 because of inherent biases in stock status determination that we could not resolve in that model. To prioritize instead the development of the stock synthesis models, results suggesting the output parameters could be used for stock status determination, including metrics related to spawning stock biomass and SSB status, with the idea being in the view of the review panel, the ability of SS to provide an SSB status and major advancements relative to previous assessments. And last but not least, they suggested the model-free traffic light analysis should continue to be developed as a complementary analysis. And the thought being that it may prove useful in the interim between formal updates to the stock synthesis models. These results were accepted for management use by the Scienids boards in May of 2022, and that guidance was used to guide the assessment results being presented today. Before I go into the results, I want to briefly discuss the reference points the SAS used for stock status determination during discussions of both the stock synthesis models and the traffic light analysis. For overfishing determination, the current Interstate Fishery Management Plan defines the overfishing threshold as SPR 30%, while the target SPR is SPR 40%. They have benchmarks are in terms of age 2 fish, and there are levels of fishing mortality that achieves the SPR of the same percentage. Currently, an overfish status reference point is not defined in the Interstate Fishery Management Plan. However, the transition to the stock synthesis framework, tracking the full age structure of the population in this framework, and results of the simulation assessment suggest these models can and do accurately track changes in SSB through time, and hence should be able to provide an overfish stock status determination. Here, the SAS proposed using the analogous SSB 30% and SSB 40% as an appropriate threshold and target for overfish status determination. These SSB benchmarks are the levels of SSB associated with stock fish to equilibrium at the SPR of the same percentage. For status determination, consistent with previous assessments, we use 3-year running averages, with terminal year status being based on the average SPR and spawning stock biomass during the years 2019, 2020, and 2021. While we do have some SPR estimates for 2022 and SSB estimates for 2022 and 2023, these were heavily reliant on preliminary 2022 fishing year data, with individual data sets missing either all or partial data related to length and or age compositions. Of note, the simulation assessment reviewers recommend tracking both annual and 3-year average for stock status determinations, and we did provide both in the report and figures shown later on. For the TLA analysis, no reference points using these model-free indicators are currently defined in the Fisheries Management Plan, nor was guidance provided on operational reference points provided during the simulation assessment. However, TLA fishery performance was evaluated for its ability to indicate an overfishing condition defined as the known simulated population experiencing F greater than F 30%. While the adult abundance metric was evaluated for its ability to indicate an overfish condition defined as a simulated population SSB falling below SSB 30%. So there is an indirect relationship between the TLA threshold that we'll be presenting and the Fishery Management Plan F threshold and the proposed SSB threshold. That said, the operational reference points provided herein were developed by the SAS in the current assessment, with overfishing being defined as occurring when the fishery performance metric, which takes into account a ratio of catch to fishery independent subadult indices, was red in any of the past 3 years. The SAS defined an overfish status determination when adult abundance, a metric based on adult relative abundance trends, was red in any of the past 3 years. And then the SAS went on to identify 3 additional potential management action triggers, which I'll let you guys read through here, with the intent of making these model-free indicators in general more responsive to changes in the population when there were concerning trends in the stock. With that background information in mind, I'll now jump directly into the primary results of the current assessment. With final stock status determination for the southern population being primarily based on the results of the stock synthesis analysis, though it was supported by 3 complementary analyses, a traffic light analysis, which provided direct stock status determinations itself, as well as some other 2 additional analysis techniques we use, escape data limited control rule method and a Cormack-Jolly-Seaver tally recapture model. In the sake of time here, I'm only going to present sort of the main results from the stock synthesis and TLA analysis. I do have some slides on the escape method and the Cormack-Jolly-Seaver models if y'all are interested. I'm happy to pull up at the end. So for the southern model, we had a catch series going back to the 1981 fishing year, where the fishing year was defined as running from September 1st through August 31st, which was a little bit of a change from previous assessments, but better aligns with the spawning season of the of the red drum population, as well as when the fishery is being operated throughout the year. These catch data streams by state were able to be split into harvest and release time series. And we separated the catch data streams by state, as each state in the that comprise the southern population made regulation changes independently, with regulations across blocks of years not being broadly consistent across states. Further, all three states had large recreational fleets that contributed significantly to the fishery. To get a total recreational removals, we assumed an 8% discard mortality rate for released fish, which was also consistent with what had been used in ASMF 2017, CDR 44, and I think as far back as CDR 18 as well. So herein, I'm starting to show a plot showing annual fishing gear removals by fleet component. With the fleets going, and I'm only showing data through the 1990 fishing year thus far. The fleets go from a very small commercial harvest, which is that very thin dark green that you're seeing at the bottom, followed by 3 direct harvest recreational fleets, and then the 3 recreational discard fleets, 1 for each state. What we see is in this early period of the assessment history is we see a rapid decrease in removals in the early to mid 1980s, with 3-year average peak removals declining from 2.3 million fish being removed annually from 1983 to 1985 to about 700,000 fish being removed annually during that 3-year period from 1988 to 1990. Since then, we've seen increasing removals since the mid-1980s across the region, removals meeting and exceeding early 1980s removals since the early 2010s, peaking at about 2.5 million fish being removed annually during the period 2016 through 2018 from the southern population, represented by that red dashed line, or not dashed, but horizontal line. Other data sources available for the southern population included 10 considered fishery independent indices, of which 7 were retained in the final SS model and 8 in the TLA analysis. These represented a mixture, and they'll be color-coded, recruitment, sub-adult, and adult surveys from South Carolina, from Georgia, and from Florida. Those with a strike-through were ultimately not included in a southern-based SS model, though the Georgia Longline Survey was retained in the traffic light analysis as an adult abundance metric. Each of these indices were standardized to account for extraneous covariate effects on catchability at the time of individual collections of red drum. Previous assessments, while they had generally used these same indices, included them as straight nominal indices. In other words, they used them as arithmetic mean catches per unit effort. Which does not account for environmental conditions or unintended survey distributional changes and their potential effects on catchability. This represented a significant advancement in index treatment relative to previous assessments, with such standardization becoming common practice in most contemporary stock assessments. Briefly, I'll just sort of show the trends by sort of index type of the surveys. Here I'm showing the 3 southern population recruitment indices. We had an early South Carolina Rotenone survey, and then 2 more contemporary Florida 21.3 meter Holstein and the Georgia Gillnet survey. And what I'm showing here is that broadly speaking, when they're during the period of overlap, the recruitment surveys are in agreement with each other as far as trends are concerned. Here I'm showing the similar graph, but focusing on the southern population sub-adult indices, starting with a historic South Carolina StopNet survey, and then the South Carolina TravelNet survey, and the Florida Winter 83 meter Holstein survey. And once again, you're seeing that broad agreement regarding index trends in the sub-adult population for red drum. Then last but not least, here are the 3 available adult abundance indices, although 2 of these 3 were dropped from the final stock synthesis model, that being the historic longline and the Georgia longline. What you see is that at least during this period of overlap, the South Carolina longline survey was generally suggesting a stable to decreasing population throughout the time series, while the Georgia longline survey was suggesting a potential increasing population through the late 2010s, followed by decreased sets. And when we looked at this relative to our other data sources, it seemed that the South Carolina Long Line Survey was more in agreement with the long-term trends in the subadult indices than the Georgia Long Line Survey. When these fishery-dependent catch data streams, along with the fishery-independent data are combined, it means we have catch, discard, abundance index, length composition, age composition, and conditional age at length composition data available from throughout the time series. And with that, I'll jump into the main results of the Southern Population Stock Synthesis Model. When we look at estimates of fishing mortality by fleets, generally speaking, we are seeing fishing mortality in Florida, represented by the red line, being greater than that in South Carolina, which is the blue line, which is generally greater than or equal to the exploitation rate in Georgia, the yellow line. Further, we see that in all three states, the F has increased since the late 1980s and early 1990s lows in all three fleets. And we observed that recent peaks in fishing mortality at the state levels and hence exploitation is at or above levels observed in the early 1980s, represented by the horizontal dashed lines. When these F patterns are combined with estimates of selectivity and retention across sizes and ages, and are translated in estimates of spawning potential ratio, we get the time series shown here, with the annual SPRs being represented by the green line with open circles, with 95% confidence intervals represented by the dashed, and then the 3-year average being represented by the gold line. I'll just note that while this time series does extend through the 2022 fishing year, as I noted previously, for stock status determination, the SAS used the 3-year average in 2021. So basically ignore that data that's showing up in that red highlighted area there. This time series of SPR shows the SPR was below the management threshold of 30% in the early 1980s. Though early management actions and subsequent reductions in catch allow for an ending of overfishing and a rebuilding of SPR through the early 1990s. Where it reached levels above 0.6 for the population, before it starts a slow descent to levels below 0.3 at the annual scale in 10 of 12 years since 2010, and then all years since 2013. Similarly, 3-year average SPR suggests overfishing of the stock began in 2014, with a 3-year average SPR from 2019 to 2021 being 0.207. Similarly, the SS model produces a time series of spawning stock biomass that can be compared to an SSB threshold. That's what I'm depicting here with both annual estimates, once again in that green line with 95% confidence intervals represented by the dashes, and the 3-year average being represented by the gold line. Similarly, once again, note that while the model produces an SSB estimate for 2022, for stock status determination, we base SSB and hence overfish status only through the 2021 data. Here, the SSB is shown relative to the SSB 30% threshold reference point estimating the model, such that the stock is considered overfished when relative SSB falls below 1. We notice a few things with regards to spawning stock biomass. First, annual estimates are much smoother through time, reflecting the integration of many years of reproductively active females in the population, and hence slow expected change in spawning stock biomass you would expect. Given this, relative SSB increased from low, severely depressed overfished levels in the 1980s through the 1990s and 2020s, though the rate of change does slow in the 2000s. Since the 2000s, relative SSB decreases steadily from the late 2000s through the terminal year as SPR continues to decrease, such that by 2020, the 3-year average relative SSB suggests the stock has once again transitioned to an overfished stock status, which is maintained through terminal year of assessment. And that 2021 terminal year stock status gave it relative SSB of 0.881. The SAS included 9 sensitivity runs in the assessment report provided to reviewers to assess the stability of stock status determinations and time series of SPR and spawning stock biomass to various influential assumptions. This included looking at sensitivity of the model to different model configurations and assumptions, MRIP catch estimates, including a sensitivity run where we reduced recreational catches by 30% based on preliminary guidance from MRIP staff and the pilot study they conducted to date, although we won't know the final results of that until I believe 2026. Assumptions regarding natural mortality, And then the impact of assuming different descending limb selectivity patterns for the recreational fleets, with one basically allowing less selectivity on large fish, a narrower dome, and the other more selectivity on larger fish, a wider dome. Overall, all of these sensitivity analyses produce very similar SPR and relative SSB trends. It's a little hard to see here, but the base model is in a light blue. It's sort of in the center of all of these data points on both of these figures on the right. With other SPR and SSB trends from these 9 different sensitivity analyses be represented by the other colored lines. The largest variability was with regards to when the model suggested spawning stock biomass, which is the lower right figure, had increased to above threshold levels as the stock was rebuilding in the 1990s. With the timing of rebuilding in the 1990s varying from as early as 1990, and a higher national mortality scenario, which implies you could fish the population harder, to 1997, and a lower M scenario, which implies you could cause overfishing and hence overfish conditions at lower fishing pressures. Notably, the terminal year overfishing status did not differ across any of these runs, while the terminal year SSB status only changed for the run using a later start year, which had a shorter time series to estimate the correct scale for spawning stock biomass. And you see it's right at that overfished limit in the bottom right figure in the terminal year. Now we went through the stock synthesis base model. Let's see how the traffic light analysis approach, which was also reviewed as part of the simulation assessment, lines up with regards to stock status determination and trends in the southern population exploitation. So very briefly, as in the simulation assessment, we focus our efforts of the traffic light analysis using 3 model-free indicators. On the left, a recruitment indicator, which uses a recruitment signals available from our fishery independent recruitment surveys. In the middle, a fishery performance indicator, which divides the annual total removals of slot-sized fish divided by slot-sized fishery independent survey indices of abundance to develop a relative exploitation and hence F indicator for the subadult population. And then an adult abundance indicator on the right, which uses fishery independent adult index data and can be thought of as a metric for spawning stock biomass. For each of these indicators, we use a reference period from 1991 through 2013, which per the most recent accepted assessment for management use was a period when the southern population was likely not experiencing overfishing and not overfish, with these results being broadly supported by the results of the current stock synthesis models. Further, a grid search was used based on the simulation assessment and the TLA performance therein to determine the number of years and threshold levels for percent red to minimize the bias in stock status determination. This combination varied by metric and stock, with recruitment suggesting that only 1 year being represented in the terminal year by this sort of slightly shaded final year in 2021. At a threshold with red exceeding 0.05 was indicative of poor recruitment. The threshold is represented by the horizontal black line. For fishery performance, it's suggested 6 consecutive years of red exceeding the 0.52 threshold level should elicit a management trigger. And then for adult abundance, the grid search suggested 9 consecutive years of red exceeding a 0.78 threshold to elicit a management trigger. Though in the name of precautionary management and given the life history of red drum, the SAS recommended having the threshold to 0.39, which is the line that you're showing here. For the next slide, it's important to note that a yellow status is calculated when the annual estimate is either yellow or red in all years in a shaded block, e.g. all 6 years of the fishery performance metric. And you only get an elevated action when the metric is red in all years. So what becomes apparent before I go into the final, into the next slide is the indication of, what becomes apparent is the indication of declining trends in all 3 southern stock characteristics, with recruitment indicators being red every year from 2010 through 2022, and 21 of the last 28 years since 1995. Fishery performance being red every year from 2013 through 2022, and yellow or red every year since 2002. And adult abundance showing a decreasing proportion green since the mid-2010s. When action levels are tabulated across the terminal years of assessment and consideration of the number of years to trigger and threshold levels, He observed that both the recruitment and fishery performance metrics suggested elevated action in the terminal year, 2021, while the adult abundance metrics suggested moderate action. Based on the reference points developed by the SAS, these results indicate the stock was experiencing overfishing in the terminal year of the assessment, as fishery performance was red for at least one of the last 3 years. In actuality, it was red in all 3 of the terminal years. This is consistent with the terminal year stock status determination from the primary stock synthesis model. Regarding SSB status, the TLE analysis based on the preliminary reference points developed by the SAS suggests the southern population was not overfished in the terminal year, as adult abundance was not red for at least one of the last 3 years. This does differ from the overfish status determination from the SS model, though it is important to note that the SS model suggests the stock had just recently transitioned to an overfish state. This is consistent with 2 additional TLA management triggers identified by the SAS that were triggered, though we did not relate these to specific stock status determinations. First, both fishery performance and adult abundance were yellow and or red in each of the past 3 years, which the SAS interpreted as a sign of increasing catch and or decreasing subadult abundance, which would jeopardize the abundance of adults in the future. And the second, recruitment was red and adult abundance was yellow in each of the past 3 years, which the SAS interpreted as a sign of consistent below average recruitment, increasing the chance of future declines in adult abundance. So that sort of concludes the information that I built in for the southern population, and now we will transition to the northern population. While we attended a stock synthesis model and also the SCAPE method, note the SAS made stock status determinations for the northern population using the results of the traffic light analysis. In the case of SS and SCAPE results, these should be viewed as complementary analyses here. Beginning with the general data available, for the northern model, we had catch series going back to the 1981 fishing year through the 2022 fishing year, with catch split into commercial and recreational fleets. For the commercial fishery, we separated the catch into 2 time series, one representing catches made by the commercial gill net and beach seine fleet, and the other catches made by the other commercial gears fleet, with the commercial gill net beach seine fleet being further subdivided into a time series of direct harvest and dead discards. For the recreational fishery, catches were once again combined across all states in the northern populations, with catches being primarily derived from North Carolina and Virginia, with the catch streams once again being split, as in the southern model, into a harvest and release time series, with total recreational removals being calculated in the southern population by applying an 8% discard mortality rate to released fish. On the left, I'm showing the time series of recreational harvest, recreational dead discards, and commercial gill net discards in numbers of fish, which is analogous to the plot I showed for the southern population. Throughout this time series, we observe a period of decreasing removals in the early 1990s, with a 3-year average number of fish removed annually declining from about 430,000 fish to a low of 150,000 fish by 1996. Since the mid-1990s, harvest has been increasing and exceeded late 1980s annual harvest since the late 2010s, with a peak of 1.08 million fish removed annually from the northern population via the recreational and commercial gill net discard fleets from 2011 to 2013. Now I'm bringing in the commercial harvest fleets on the right. Unfortunately, we only have catch information available from these fleets, available in harvest weight with the units of metric tons. Also shown is the horizontal dashed line is 250,000 pound commercial cap that has been placed since 19. It's important to realize that commercial harvest shown here represents a fraction of recreational removals, with recreational removals representing greater than 90% of annual removals over the last 10 years. Commercial harvest, with this in mind, this time series of commercial harvest suggests steady to decreasing harvest throughout the time series, with removals in most recent years being below the 250,000 pound cap. Other data sources available for the northern population included 3 fishery independent indices from North Carolina. This is and continues to be one of the data limitations for the northern model, not having survey data for the population outside of North Carolina, and hence the North Carolina abundance trends is being used to represent the entire stock's abundance trends. As known for the southern population, each of these indices were standardized to account for extraneous covariate effects on catchability, with the resulting indices being shown here. Going from the top left being the recruitment survey, in the middle is the subadult survey, and in the bottom right is the North Carolina Longline survey. When these fishery-dependent catch data streams along with fishery-independent data are combined, once again, it means we have catch, discard, index, composition data available from throughout the time series. Unfortunately, the SAS was not able to develop a base stock synthesis model due to uncertainty and instability in the Northern Stock SS model. This ultimately led the SAS to determine the model should not be used for stock status determination. Instead, in the report, we presented two alternative models that independently each showed some troubling diagnostics, but collectively may give an indication of the trend in F, SPR, and spawning stock biomass observed in the northern population. The first we termed the estimated selectivity model, with this model suggesting narrow selectivity for the recreational fleet and low selectivity for large size fish, which was in conflict with published literature and expert opinion. This model also proved highly unstable and had convergence issues. The second model we termed the hybrid selectivity model. This model fixed the selectivity of the commercial gillnet beach seine and recreational fleets based on expert opinion, with it ultimately suggesting a less productive northern population. Despite very different model scales, similar trends in F and SPR were suggested by each of these two models. Thus, it appears both models are picking up on the same trend of increasing F throughout the time series, even if model scale is uncertain, with F being shown on the left and the corresponding relative spawning potential ratio being shown on the right. So given these concerns to the stock synthesis model, the SAS decided to use the results of the TLA analysis for stock status determination. Similar to the southern population, the northern stock TLA analysis focused on the same three model-free indicators: recruitment, fishery performance, and adult abundance. Here, instead of a 1991 through 2013 reference period, we use a 1996 through 2013 reference period, which once again was supported by the results of the current assessments that's been recommended for use for management. Before going into stock status determinations, I do want to draw attention to the recent decline, higher proportion red in fishery performance. This would be consistent with the increasing exploitation, which was suggested by the stock synthesis model. This is being shown here in the middle graph. When action levels are tabulated across the terminal years of the assessment, in consideration of the number of years to trigger and threshold levels, we observed that both recruitment and fishery performance metrics suggested moderate action in the terminal year, while the adult abundance metric suggested no action. Based on the reference points the SAS developed, this would lead to the conclusion the northern population is neither overfished nor experiencing overfishing. Despite these stock status findings, the SAS did note multiple years of yellow fishery performance and increasing frequency of yellow for recruitment as areas to watch, as these could be early signs of overexploitation. And then last but not least, as far as future research, we recommended that the next assessment be conducted as a benchmark in 2029 with data through the 2027 fishing year, and update to the traffic light analysis every 2 years between the assessments. With some primary research recommendations being to do research to collect data on recreational discard size structure, which continues to be a data limitation. Expand tag recapture analyses to states outside of South Carolina. Develop surveys tracking subadults in Virginia and adults in Florida and Virginia. And conduct studies to estimate movement rates to support spatial models. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions now, although I think we have decided that we'll probably do
questions for you now.
Okay, that's fine.
Well,
I had coffee here, so thank you.
all right. Wow. Thank you, Joey. Dr. Ballinger. Mr. Brown, you've had your card on vertical the whole meeting. You have a question from the start, sir?
Yes, I'm mainly want to talk about the northern stock.
Okay, perfect. That's what I would like to do, is let's have questions on the northern stock first, walk through those, and then we'll go to the southern stock. That's okay. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Okay, I'm a commercial fisherman on the Potomac River, tributary of the Chesapeake Bay in the state of Maryland. What we've been seeing over the past number of years, when I started fishing my brother back in 1964, when I got out of grade school, we didn't even know what a redfish was. Then they came in Back in the 80s, you might see 1, 2 in the 90s. Nothing to speak of. Over the past 3, 4, 5 years, the number of red drum that we have in the state of Maryland on the western shore and on the eastern shore and on the Potomac River has raised dramatically. Just the other day, I was out and I fished one of my pound nets, and we call them bulls. They're the big fish. They're about anywhere from 42 to 50 inches long. I had like 15 of them in one net, 8 in another, 6. We've been dealing with these large fish like that. So this number of fish, maybe it's due to the climate change that they're coming in the Chesapeake Bay that we never saw before, because we've seen all types of different fish. But just on my way up here last night, I had a fisherman who fishes a pound net just on the inside of mine, wanted to know if I fished my net. I told him no. He said, well, I just turned loose approximately 2,000 pounds of, he calls them puppy drums is what we call them up there. And they were ranging, he said, from about 15 to 19 inches long. They've been catching them on the eastern shore in a number of places, the chop tank, the little chop tank, down in the sound. And you can go catch on hook and line any amount that you want. These fish are building more and more every year. And they have also, they love crabs. And crabs is one of our main things. And when you keep protecting, we got a 5 fish creel limit. And we're getting charged with dead discards. I was just told that in Maryland, our commercial harvest was 342 pounds. But yet we got this large amount of dead discards we got. We should be able, I would like for us at the next meeting to be able to go in and discuss this and see where we at and reevaluate this for the simple reason. The bay is changing, the weather is changing. We even got white shrimp we're catching in our rivers now in small amounts, but they've been showing up more and more, and we've started fishery for the white shrimp. So we need to be able to change with the times, and we need to do, as far as all these dead discards that we have at the present time, we should be allowed to sell most of those instead of having them float up and down the bay. That is a waste of resource. So I would like to have a discussion on this at our next meeting if we could possibly have it. Thank you. Have it put on the agenda.
Tracy's got a note to that effect. So there was no question, and that was more of a comment statement, right? You didn't have a question directly to Bill. Okay.
Yeah. Well, my question is, why are we letting all these dead discards? You know, why, if we're getting charged with this many and we have that many, if we are releasing them and they're dead, why can't we keep them? Why should our limit stay at a 5 fish creel limit? A commercial fishery doesn't have a creel limit. They may have a quota, but they don't have a creel limit. I think this needs to be addressed. I think, and it should be put on the agenda for the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Welcome to the world of red snapper. Mr. Gear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question. The recreational dead discard is 8%. Is that for both the north and the south?
Correct. That's
Okay. And what is that rate for commercial?
5% for observed live releases, and I think that's the gill net fishery, correct? So.
And that's only from North Carolina data, or does that include Chesapeake Bay data?
I think it's just North Carolina.
I think it's just North Carolina. All right, thank you.
Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, a question on where the stock delineation, where that boundary is. I think the report discussed looking at where that might be instead of just the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And there was some analysis on the separation possibly occurring around the White Oak River part of North Carolina, which is kind of that almost getting towards the southeastern part of the state. Did the analysis determine that it was pretty definitive that the boundary is pretty much at the state line, or is there kind of general uncertainty as far as exactly where that stock delineation might be?
So yeah, you're correct. We did try to look into that stock delineation to see about some finer scale potential delineation. The stock delineation is primarily based off of a genetics research study that had data from or samples from north of Cape Hatteras and then off of South Carolina, but very few sort of from that southern North Carolina region. Unfortunately, we did some life history analysis to see if we could better refine that. We just didn't have the data to be able to better refine it at this point in time. It was a research recommendation to continue looking into that.
Any other questions on the northern portion? Seeing none, any online? I guess there's no commissioners online, are there? Okay. All right. Thank you. Southern report questions. Erica.
Thank you, Dr. Ballinger, and thank you to you and the team, both the SAS and the TC, for doing this work. I had a question about a comment that you made earlier on in your presentation on the Southern stock, and that was SSB can track changes and patterns. So I'm wondering, is this SS3 model producing something that gives us a relative change over time of SSB, or if we can actually get an actual magnitude of SSB for this stock? And can you confirm that what data was used to generate the SSB estimate for the Southern stock?
I may ask Jeff to step in here a little bit, but I'll try to tackle it to start. So based on the results of the simulation assessment, that was one of the main things that we wanted to investigate from the simulation assessment, was whether an SS model that tracked the full age structure of the population was capable of deriving an SSB status determination. The results from that simulation assessment, which simulated data sets comparable to what we have in the assessment we're using today, did suggest we could come up with an SSB status using the data we should have in hand. That was supported by the findings of the simulation assessment and confirmed by the review panel who reviewed that assessment. With the primary changes being that we expanded the age structure from mounting a 7+ group to the full age structure in the stock census model. Relative to the 2013 terminal year assessment, we also had a near 20-year long line surveys, providing some information on the adult abundance stock, as well as more comfort that the signals coming through the subadult indices regarding relative year class strength and selectivity patterns were aligning with the observed long line trends we were seeing. So in the end, the Southern population assessment used, as far as an adult abundance survey, the South Carolina long line survey. We did consider a Georgia long line survey as well. It appeared to be in conflict with both the South Carolina data set as well as the subadult indices and the signals of year class strength coming through there as well. So that was dropped from the final SS model. But then we also did have information from the adults coming from the age structure being implied from the subadult indices and as they transition to the adult population. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I'll just add on the question about confidence in the absolute magnitude of SSB estimates. I think it's a typical characteristic of these assessment models that you have more confidence in abundance trends than absolute magnitude. I would say that holds here, but I don't think we saw any diagnostics that indicated that the SSB magnitudes that were being estimated were inaccurate.
So a couple follow-ups. The only adult index that we have is for South Carolina that was used in the assessment. And we don't know where the actual abundance, spotting sac abundance is centered for this stock. We don't know its location. So we could be sampling the core, we could be sampling a small amount, we could be sampling something that is representative of the whole, but right now we don't know. And then you said that one of the things that made you more confident in the SSB estimate was that it tracked with what you saw in the subadult indices. But am I correct to state that the steepness that you used in the model was that there was no relationship between adult abundance and recruitment?
Correct. We did use fixed steepness at 0.99, which applies just an average deviations around the average level of recruitment. So yes, that is correct. There's no formal spawner recruit relationship incorporated in the model. As far, yeah, so I can't remember the first part of your question, or
Well, the first part was just summing up what I heard and what I
okay,
know.
that's what I thought. I can't remember
Yeah.
the question there.
And so the question was about the steepness. And then so based on your years of experience in fishery stock assessment scientists, given all the great things that SS3 can do and can estimate beyond things that other models can't, do you have greater confidence in SPR and F or in the SSB estimate? Where does your confidence lie?
And I think as far as what I'm speaking from my personal, I was looking at Jeff to make sure that he agreed here, but yeah, I think obviously we probably have more confidence in the SPR trends or the SPR levels than the SSB levels, just because that is the more data rich component of the assessment. So.
Any others? Okay, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. So next we're going to move into the point counterpoint or punch counterpunch. We're going to, Pat's going to present the peer review panel report, and then Joey's going to come back with the I heard something, huh?
One slide.
Yeah, with the SAS review to that, and then we will have those two presentations followed by questions for both. So, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to present the CDAR review panel's conclusions and recommendations in evaluating the red drum stock assessment. Here on behalf of the chairman who could not participate today for a couple of different reasons. But to jump right into it, in terms of the review process, we wanted to thank the Southeast Data and Assessment Review staff for facilitating and coordinating the review. The panel consisted of 4 scientists, the chair, Dr. Gavin Fay from University of Massachusetts, Dr. Jeff Tingley from New Zealand, Kotaro Ono from Norway, and Dr. Katiana Verpre from Arizona State. The last 3 reviewers are from the Center for Independent Experts. And they were recruited for their expertise in marine fish ecology and population dynamics models, as well as recreational fisheries and tagging data analysis, and perhaps most importantly, catch and age models, notably the stock synthesis modeling platform. So I will summarize their findings relative to each term of reference. The first being to evaluate the assessment committee's responses to the simulation assessment recommendations and that different review panel that was conducted in 2022. And their conclusions are that the Southern stock synthesis model performance was encouraging and produced unbiased estimates. They had a lot of confidence in the SS model for the Southern stock, and that the follow-up work on the traffic light analysis reference points using a revised grid search was successfully completed in the current assessment. For the longer term future assessment work, the panel recommended testing the SS model performance over multiple scenarios using data without observation error. The second term of reference was to evaluate the data used in the stock assessment. In a nutshell, the review panel commended SAS for very thorough work in gathering and vetting all available red drum data. The assessment committee provided valid justification for excluding select data sources. And they commended the SAS on their holistic thinking to include data for different red drum life stages. Another notable improvement in the current assessment and the input data were patchwork of recreational discard length data that the assessment committee synthesized to address a notable information gap. However, more of that data, recreational discard length data, needs to be collected in the future. very critical for red drum assessments. In terms of recommendations for future assessments, the panel thought that the assessment committee should reconsider their use of scale-based age data. Typically, those are only useful for the first few years, but they thought that could be utilized more fully within the assessment analyses. The panel also had some strong opinions about index standardization, notably in future work to incorporate survey spatiotemporal changes, as well as explore habitat variables like temperature and salinity and their influence on drum abundance. The third term of reference is to evaluate the assessment methods and models. The panel concluded that the stock synthesis model specification values were well justified, and that for the southern stock, the SS model was most appropriate for characterizing the population. It's a very flexible modeling platform and approach, and a good choice for integrating the variety of data sources that we have for drum. Similar thoughts for the traffic light analysis and the northern stock, and they deemed that to be the most appropriate analytical approach for the northern population. The panel's recommendations for future work, we already touched on steepness and the stock recruitment function, but they encouraged the SAS to reconsider that steepness value or the slope of the curve and the stock recruitment function. Also, future work on exploring different reference periods for the range of years used in the traffic light analysis, and to improve their justification for the adult abundance threshold in the TLA. The fourth term of reference was to evaluate model diagnostic analyses, including sensitivity and retrospective analyses. In conclusion, the panel thought that the SS diagnostic analyses were very comprehensive, and in most runs, the model converged successfully, as shown in the plot below. Out of 200 model runs, only a handful of times did the model not converge on similar results. The sensitivity analyses for the TLA were deemed sufficient. However, again, the review panel thought that the standardized indices residual patterns showed some poor diagnostics that should be worked through in future assessments. And there were minor retrospective patterns in SSB and fishing mortality in SPR, but when compared to stock assessments for other species, the panel had no concerns about retrospective patterns. The fifth term of reference was to evaluate the methods used to characterize uncertainty. And in a nutshell, the review panel thought that the assessment committee did this very thoroughly, and we should have confidence in the results for the SS model. Also, because the traffic light analysis was conducted for the southern model, it provided similar stock status or trends and indications of concern for the southern stock. During the review workshop, the SAS completed additional model runs that were requested by the panel, and the outputs were within the range or the confidence intervals of the base run, again, building confidence in the southern outputs. A lot of review panels recommend management strategy evaluations. That's essentially another simulation framework or tool, and this panel did as well for red drum, but they thought an MSE might be useful to inform the selection of the reference points for the TLA. The next term of reference was to recommend best estimates of stock biomass abundance and exploitation. And in short, the panel agreed with the assessment committee that for the southern stock, the SS model produced the best estimates of biomass, fishing mortality, and SPR. And for the northern stock, although the stock synthesis models did not converge, and we do not have SSB estimates there, the traffic light analysis is reliable as a qualitative indicator for the three indicators that Joey presented on. Again, they had recommendations about future work in index standardization, but they also thought that the assessment committee was very thorough in the approach that they took to standardizing indices. As Joey highlighted, that hadn't been done in past red drum stock assessments, so that is an advance in the current assessment. And also for future assessment work, although the SS model did not converge consistently for the northern population, perhaps as time series get longer, that modeling may improve, and so the panel thought that the SS model should continue to be worked on for the northern stock as well. The next term of reference was to evaluate the choice of reference points and estimation methods and recommend stock status. Again, in short, the panel agreed with the reference points that were presented in the stock assessment, including the reference period used for the TLA. And the review panel agrees with the status determinations from the assessment for each region. And to wrap up, TOR 9 covers the research recommendations. In addition to those that Joey highlighted from the assessment committee, again, the review panel encouraged exploring different approaches for index standardization, as well as continuing to utilize the simulation framework that was developed in 2022. It's a really powerful tool to build on, notably to test reference points selection, as well as what's called a value of information analysis to prioritize future data collection to tell us which surveys are most useful for tracking drum trends. Joey highlighted the tagging studies and analyses that are pretty data rich for red drum. The one sort of minor recommendation from the reviewers was to evaluate different mortality associated with tagging, given that the tagging studies use different gears to catch drum. And finally, to evaluate seasonal population dynamics for each regional population that is also capable or possible within the stock synthesis framework. For the next term of reference regarding the timing of future stock assessments, again, in short, the review panel largely agreed with the assessment committee. Next benchmark in 5 years, do a TLA update every 2 years. They are encouraging, again, index standardization exploration. They thought if that could be done in the next year or two, if that's feasible, then to go ahead with that, but also recognize that the standardization they did already was pretty thorough. And then again, as Joey mentioned, there's a new MRIP pilot study and that those recreational data may change. So when they become available, to consider rerunning the SS model for the southern stock and see if the catches differ significantly. So to conclude, in terms of the review panel's remarks, the new stock assessment represents substantial progress in characterizing red drum stocks, notably the stock synthesis model provision of SSB and F and SPR for the southern stock. They found that the SS model is suitable for management advice in the south, and the panel agreed with the overfish status and overfishing conclusion. For the northern stock, they agreed that the TLA is suitable for management advice and the status determinations there. And finally, that the stock assessment subcommittee and the technical committee should be commended for very thorough examination of all the data, extensive model development, and utilizing the simulation framework, which is a first among the commission stock assessments. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Pat. And Joey with the SAS response.
Now I'll be much briefer here than my original presentation, but unfortunately, the review report was not received by the SAS until well after the initial deadline, meaning the SAS could not review and seek clarification or provide a response if necessary. So hence, hopefully all you guys saw that we provided a response in the supplemental materials, and which I'm summarizing here. Basically, we just want to clarify a couple of things and give a little bit more context regarding some of the comments that were made in the review panel report. The first thing being there was conflicting advice on the stock recruit steepness, which Erica, Ms. Burgess asked about earlier. Basically, coming out of the simulation assessment, we had been recommended by that review panel to fix steepness at 0.99, although we had initially explored and built the model using a steepness of 0.84. Hence, we took the recommendations coming out of the simulation assessment, fixed stock recruit steepness to that 0.99 value for the base model run of the southern population. That said, during the review workshop, the review committee asked us to provide a run of what would happen if we did fix it at 0.84 value, or we had also investigated a run where we freely estimated steepness as well. When we fixed it at 0.84 value, it was basically shown to have no impact on stock status. We got very similar SSB and SPR results in the same stock status determination. And when we try to freely estimate steepness, it basically went back to that upper bound and hit 0.99 and converged on that solution. For index data, although there was concerns brought up regarding the index data and potential spatiotemporal patterns in that, during the review workshop, we provided some data suggesting that the index data was shown to correspond spatially and between age classes through several different plots and different techniques. And then also we provided several requested sensitivity runs that showed no impact of overfishing stock status. And although 2 runs showed SSB status did change, the SSB in the terminal year was right at that threshold level with the same declining trend as observed in the SSB base model. I think I mentioned earlier in the base model, SSB status was 0.881, and those 2 other ones that went to 1.00 or 0.8 and 1.025 or something like that. I mean, just right at that point. And one run with SSB at threshold included an alternative index that one of the reviewers developed during the workshop had inadequate time to evaluate and consideration to develop, and we didn't necessarily feel was representative of the true index trend for that survey. The TLA reference period was based on the best scientific information available, without the review panel providing alternative being recommendation. And we did test the sensitivity of the TLA results through a sensitivity analysis, and the results being shown to be largely insensitive. And then the final one, the SAS does not believe a 2025 assessment update will change conclusions of the current assessment based off of the preliminary work we have done and the response of this model to these alternative configurations through sensitivity analyses. I think that's all I've got.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions for either Pat or Joy on the peer review report or the SAS report response? Seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Brown.
Yes, was it Chesapeake Bay included into the assessment?
What data we had available from the Chesapeake Bay was included in the assessment. So all the catch and removal data, harvest data, and discard data was included. Unfortunately, we do not have any fishery independent survey from the outside of the North Carolina region for the northern population.
Okay, would it be possible in the future to have it explored into it, the Chesapeake Bay? I mean, it's the second largest sanctuary, I mean, not sanctuary, tributary, the estuary into the world. And the amount of fish we got there, and I believe on that rockfish, we have trouble having reference points in there also.
I mean, I think it was a research recommendation from both the SAS and the review panel just to encourage the development of survey data from outside of the North Carolina region, including the Chesapeake Bay, meaning Virginia, Maryland, elsewhere, so we can look at the abundance trends in those regions.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, so now I guess we need to have a discussion or consideration of acceptance of the stock assessment and peer review. Any discussions? Anyone interested in making a motion to that effect? We may have one on the screen. Yeah, Ben.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to make a motion. Move to accept the 2024 Red Drum Benchmark Stock Assessment and Peer Review Report for management use.
Is there a second? Pat Garrett. Ben, any additional discussion?
No, I just want to thank all the work that the SAS did and the peer review panel for developing and looking at all these indices and all the reports. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
Seconder, have anything to add?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I thank the assessment team. I think they did a great job. Mr. Brown has brought up a good point about we're seeing more and more red drum in Chesapeake Bay, along with other species as well. And, I have been trying to get, I'm glad that's one of the recommendations to try to have some of these surveys in the Bay, because, it's going to cost money, but we need to do that. If this is becoming such a primary fishery in not only in Virginia, but in Maryland and Potomac River as well, we need to have this information. And we really don't have anything other than catch and effort data from recreational commercial fisheries. So we need a longline survey. We need a trommel net or a gill net survey, similar to what they have in the South. So I'm glad that's one of the recommendations. And I just wanted to reiterate that and say that I'm stressing that we need to get that information.
Yeah, Mr. Garrett, I did find it interesting, Mr. Garrett, when you left Georgia about 7 years ago, there was a live well in the back of your U-Haul. I'm just curious whether you hauled any of those puppy drum to Virginia.
Really want me to answer that?
I know your affinity for kayak fishing for red drum. Okay, any additional serious discussion about the motion? Seeing none, is there any opposition to the motion? Any abstentions? Seeing none, we will accept this motion by consensus or unanimous consent. Thank you. Now the real matter at hand is how do we consider this for management response? What are we going to do about the overfishing status? Who leads this discussion? Oh, I didn't. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone have any thoughts on how we're going to use the assessment moving forward? I'm looking to the far end of the table. Anyway, Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Interested to see and to be able to use this for management use in the southern region. I have a motion I'd like to propose. If I don't know if we have that ready or.
Before you read that, Ben, just a statement that I'll make, and I was thinking about. So SAS has recommended perhaps an update in 25, right? That's what I just heard you say.
No, the SAS is recommending not to do an update in 2025 because there's not going to be a whole lot of new information, and we're not expecting the index data, and we're not going to have any new recreational update from the MRIP survey as far as the impact of potential effort changes until 2026. Anyways, we were recommending a 2029 benchmark with a 2027 terminal year, with potentially a TLA update in 2027.
Okay, I misread that because that's exactly what I was thinking, was waiting for what we see as the new MREP calibration or estimate, in addition to maybe seeing the impacts of Florida's changes after the terminal year of this assessment may make a big impact. So maybe 27.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Ben, go ahead. Sorry.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I make a motion to request that the SAS TC to produce the static spawning potential ratio for a range of slot size limits between 14 inches and 27 inches, associated with bag limits ranging from 0 to 5 fish per person for the southern region and or South Carolina, Georgia, Florida individually.
Thank you. And is there a second? Spud. Yeah, Mel's from the same. So Spud's on the second. Nope, Mel can't make it. Right? Same delegation? Okay. So that was Mr. Woodward with the second. Additional discussion on that one? Mr. Matt Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think it's a great suggestion to support the motion. A question, could a similar analysis be done for the northern population, even though we don't have a stock synthesis model running for that assessment, just the traffic light? Is that something that could also be done for the northern?
Mr. Ballard, Dr. Ballard.
I think Jeff and I have been to some discussions about this moving forward. I think we got to even think about the southern population, how we're going to implement this, to do this as far as an update. I think for the northern population, it is going to be difficult, but because the TLA analysis is more of a qualitative indicator, it's a little bit harder to determine how a bag limit or size limit change is likely to affect that indicator moving forward. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think it would look like a different analysis. I mean, we could do some bag limit analyses on the MRIP data alone, looking at recreational impacts. I think that's probably the best we could do. I don't know that we could quantify what kind of changes to SPR those would have like we would for the southern stock with an SS model.
All right, thanks. I'll come back to that, wait for this motion to be dispensed. But I think some sort of analysis from the TC and SAS on what could be done in the northern population would be worth exploring, but it sounds different than what we're talking about here, so I'll just wait.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion on the motion? Eric.
So one thing that I think might be fun for the TC to deal with as they tackle this is the assessment ended in the terminal year ended August of 2021, I believe, and then in September 1st of 2022, Florida implemented major changes to our recreational limits for red drum. We manage red drum at a regional scale in Florida, with the Northeast region being the top 4 counties essentially of the state, and then the Indian River Lagoon being the next region. And outside of the Indian River Lagoon, we've got a Southeast region that goes to the Florida Keys. So I think if I had the ability to divine what was happening and driving a lot of the assessment, habitat issues in the Indian River Lagoon were of concern to the state of Florida at the same time this assessment was wrapping up. And we saw declines in catch rates, decline in our abundance indices, although these abundance indices for the IRL were not used in the stock assessment. And the state responded by making redfish catch and release only in the Indian River Lagoon. So 2/3 of our coastline essentially is zero retention for redfish. And then in the northeast part of the state, we cut our bag limit and vessel limit in half. So it'll be interesting to see how the TC handles projections with the change for what was in the model and then what's currently in play now. And I'd love to have some discussion or response from the TC when we get these tables back to see how that was handled.
And if I could add on to that, I mean, so when you're able to do this that we're asking, you're doing it based on data that was in the assessment. So the table is essentially 2 years old. It may show that Florida's already done what this table may request them to do, right? It's not pulling new data from Florida to put into it. Is that right?
So yeah, I'll clarify one thing. The assessment used data through August of 2023, at least the preliminary data that we had, because the fishing year 2022 data would have been September 1st, 2022 through August 31st, 2023. However, we had only preliminary data on some of the survey data. We didn't have full age data available, as well as I don't think the Florida indices were able to be updated through that 2022 terminal year. And For that reason, we recommended only using through the 2021 terminal year for stock status determination, which would have ended in August 31st of 2022. So right about the time that those regulation changes went into place. So you're correct. Those were not accounted for sort of in the model terminal year estimates. I think going to your point, I think the intent, I mean, we'll have to talk about this as a TAC, SAS and TC, would be basically to use the data through that 2021 terminal year and look at the effects if through that data, what changes in size and bag limits would have had. So in that instance, we should see the potential effects of any bag and size limit, or I think it was mainly a bag reduction Florida had, correct, in the most recent, would have likely had on the population moving forward. So.
Thank you. Yes, John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No concern with the motion, just kind of curious. Has this species always been managed with the slot limit? And if so, I mean, it doesn't seem to have achieved the purpose of the slot is supposed to allow more spawners out there so that we have, you know, smooth out recruitment somewhat. I mean, couldn't we overfish just as well with a minimum size? And it would be less of a burden on both anglers and enforcement.
It's been managed with a slot as long as I can remember, but I think, Erica, you have a point there.
So I might challenge Pat's affinity for this species myself, but you know, this truly is a management success story. We went from 2 coasts of the U.S. being overfished and completely depleted for this stock when ASMFC, the southern states, on the coast of the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, and Congress stepping in and basically created a moratorium for this fishery. And through very conservative management measures, managing for an SPR, rebuilt this from no older fish, because we fished on those adults, to a fishery now where we've got ages through age 30, which is a really well rebuilt stock. And the decision and the history of this fishery is that it was decided that we'd manage for these high SBRs for catch and abundance, and we constrain ourselves to an inshore fishery based on the life history of these fish. So no harvest in the EEZ, which is where the majority of the adults are. The adults only come inshore seasonally for spawning. And what we're fishing on is age, depending on your state, age 1 through age 4 fish. In the state of Florida, our slot limit is so narrow, we're fishing on fish within a year's class most often. So we want to preserve this fishery for the important recreational fishery it is, and decided to leave those spawning adults be and have them contribute to our inshore fishery. And I don't think that there's any appetite for changing away from a slot.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that from the George perspective, John, again.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. That was very, it's just, I have experience with the fish going way back to the overfishing days in the Gulf. I remember I was working for Texas Parks and Wildlife back then, and we were stocking red drum by the millions. But that was during the black and redfish craze when they were, you know, trawling all the big red drum out of the Gulf. I was just curious. I mean, I have no, obviously, I don't mind doing it this way. I was just curious if there was any way to perhaps hypothesize what would happen if just a minimum size was used rather than a slot.
And before I call the question, just a question to TC, ballpark or to SAS, ballpark on when we might see this?
Sorry, we were not probably the May meeting, not the, I think you have a spring meeting or a winter meeting before then. So we would think the spring meeting might be a reasonable time frame to have these projections completed.
Okay. Good, thank you. Okay, time for the question. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, any abstentions? Seeing none, motion passes by consent or unanimous consent. All right. Wow, that was easier than I thought. Seeing as how we're slightly ahead of schedule, and Mr. Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to come back to some thoughts on the northern population.
Sorry
as
about
far
that.
as analysis. No worries. So I don't think not necessarily a motion. I guess we just give board consensus, head nodding or whatever. Look at some different bag limit analyses for the northern range. Possibly looking at any benefits to dropping that maximum size limit in the northern range to kind of allow those fish to escape the slot and enter kind of that protected zone a little quicker. And also if the TC and SAS can provide some more information as far as what moderate action means in the traffic light analysis. Yeah, I didn't ask that during the Q&A. I thought that might be something that we could maybe get a little more information back when we revisit this again to determine what's the most appropriate management action to take. Thanks.
Okay, I see Tracy's feverishly copying all that down, so we've got that sort of as an action item for May, or TC for the maybe. Okay, very good. Anything else? All right, so before we move into the discussion of the risk and uncertainty tool, my blood pressure medicine's kicking in, so why don't we all take a 5-minute recess? We'll come back in 5 minutes. Yeah, that's not quite a gavel sound, but let's get back to it. Dr. Drew's going to pull up her presentation and we'll get going. All right. So next we're going to have a discussion of the risk and uncertainty tool inputs for Red Drum. And Dr. Drew's going to lead us through that. All yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the background on the tool, the basic inputs for the tool, and the results of the weighting that the board provided, and then sort of go into what that means, what the outputs are, and how the board could potentially use this tool going forward. So as a reminder, ASMFC is pilot testing this risk and uncertainty tool with the Red Drum assessment. We did try to pilot test this with the TATOG assessment earlier, a couple years ago, but it turned out the TATOG assessment did not need to take any management action as a result of that assessment. And so while we got through the weightings part and the technical input part, we did not end up need to sort of like fully use the tool. We didn't need to use any of the output of that tool. And so it kind of fizzled out as a testing experiment. So we're on to Red Drum now. And we are testing this out further with this assessment and this board. And just as a reminder, the board is not obligated to use this tool as any part of the this process. This is an option that we are putting forward for the board to consider and to test out and to then either use it or not use it and provide feedback via the policy board. So the goals of this tool are to provide a more structured framework around risk and uncertainty for board discussions and to provide more transparency on the factors that go into final management decisions. So the risk and uncertainty tool has two components. One is the technical inputs, which are scores from the technical committee and the committee on economics and social science, which score various factors. So for the technical committee, they are scoring stock status, how uncertain the assessment model is, how much management and environmental uncertainty there is, and sort of the relative ecosystem importance of the species in question. And then the SAS is scoring information on the commercial and recreational importance, as well as the short and long-term socioeconomic impacts of the proposed management. So within the tool, the scores for stock status and uncertainty essentially will encourage an additional buffer to the management action, that they will sort of push management action to be more precautionary. However, the socioeconomic components sort of push back on that potential buffer or that potential precautionary approach. And they essentially provide a way for the board to accept a higher risk level in order to mitigate potential negative socioeconomic impacts. So the second component of this tool is the board weights. So those scores are provided by our various technical committees, and then the board scores how important each factor is when making the decision. So basically, this is trying to get at how do you, the board, as decision makers, balance the question of stock status, uncertainty, and potential socioeconomic impacts when you are setting a quota or setting a regulation change. And the goal, again, is to provide this overall transparency to say we are selecting a level of risk that matches our management objectives, and that management objective is sort of realized through putting more weight or less weight on these different factors that influence our decision. So the output of this tool is a combination of those technical weights. So how much uncertainty is there? How negative or positive is stock status? How negative or positive are the socioeconomic impacts? Combined with those board weights to provide a recommended risk tolerance level that management action should strive to achieve. Okay, so what does that mean exactly? So for red drum, for example, in the South, overfishing is occurring according to our most recent stock assessment. In this case, F needs to be reduced to the F target. So how much of a reduction in removals is necessary to achieve that F target next year? There's uncertainty in this process, right? And our projections aren't necessarily saying, here's the one right answer. It's saying, for any given reduction, there is the possibility, here's your probability of achieving that F rate. So if you take no reduction, there's a low probability that you will achieve F target, and this is risky. However, if you close the fishery completely, there's a high probability that you will achieve the F target. This is very precautionary. You'll have a high probability of the management outcome that you want, but obviously there would be significant short-term socioeconomic impacts. So you want to take a reduction that has a probability of achieving that F target somewhere in between those two extremes, between very likely, very unlikely. Somewhere there's the right answer. But what is that in between? What is that right answer? Is it 50%? Is it 60%? Is it 45%? This tool will provide a recommended probability of achieving that F target based on stock status, various forms of uncertainty, and the socioeconomic considerations, all of which is weighted by what the board considers most and least important. So as a note, this tool is really only useful for data-rich assessments with the capacity to do projections. This is sort of the first module in the Commission's larger, ideally, risk and uncertainty policy. So we're focused on this sort of data-rich scenario where we have a model that can do projections and provide and use this actual input. I think down the road, the Commission would like to develop this policy further to deal with data-poor stocks or stocks that don't have a traditional model, but we're not there yet. So we're focused on this small component of what will hopefully become a larger risk and uncertainty policy or risk and uncertainty tool. But in the meantime, this means that we can use this tool for the southern stock, but not the northern stock. We did do the scores and the weights for both regions for comparison, but the output from this tool can't really be used in that traffic light framework the way it can be used in the stock synthesis framework. So now I'm going to go over the technical input scores. Again, these were provided by the TC and the CES. So in these figures, we're going to have our southern region in orange and our northern region in blue. And so scores are provided for both. Stock status scores basically on 4 considerations. What's your probability of being below the SSB threshold? So that is, what's your probability that you are overfished? What's the probability that you are below the SSB target? Then what is your probability that you are above the F threshold? That is, what's the probability of overfishing occurring? And then what is your probability of being above the F target? In the northern region, you can see that the northern region was not overfished and not experiencing overfishing. So the probability that it's overfished is 0. The TC did consider that there was a small likelihood that they were below the target based on the trends in the available data. And in the northern region, they were not experiencing overfishing, so that probability of overfishing is 0. But based on trends in removals and the data, they think there is a high probability that they are above the F target. Meanwhile, in the south, the stock was overfished. So in this case, the model, the stock assessment subcommittee did not develop the exact probabilities. It just says overfished and overfishing is occurring. So it gets a 1 for being overfished. And obviously, if you're below that SSB threshold, you are also below that SSB target. So that gets a 1 as well. And similarly with the overfishing, you get a 1 because overfishing is occurring. And if overfishing is occurring, you are also above that F target. So that gets a 1 as well. So these are probably the most straightforward, just output right from the stock assessment. The next component is the sort of other risk and uncertainty factors. So this includes model uncertainty. And in this case, you can see that there is more model uncertainty in the north than there is in the south. So that while the south does have some uncertainty associated with that SS model, there is more in the north because we're relying on this qualitative traffic light approach that is not able to fully synthesize the data that is available. So there's also the question of management uncertainty. And so in this case, the TC was really considering things like the fact that this is a predominantly recreational species, which makes it harder to control total removals and means there's more uncertainty from the MRIP PSEs and things like that. In the north, you can see that's slightly higher, but in the south, slightly lower, but about this, not too different. Environmental uncertainty, the TC was considering things like the effect of climate change on recruitment, as well as population dynamics and the population range for both the north and the south. And it scored fairly high because I think the TC doesn't have a strong sense of whether the climate change and other environmental impacts are going to be a net positive or a net negative in terms of recruitment and in terms of whether this stock is simply moving north or whether it is actually able to expand its range and increase its population size. So that was probably the highest source of uncertainty here is what is the potential productivity of the stock into the future. And then ecosystem importance was scored here as somewhat lower than the others in terms of this is, an important part of the ecosystem, sort of a benthic predator, but maybe not a keystone predator that is important to the overall function of the ecosystem or more important than other species to the overall ecosystem. It got scored a little higher in the south, mainly because that's where sort of the core of the population, there's a larger biomass down there. And so the TC believed that the overall economic importance or impact would be larger in the south than in the north, where it has more competitors for that specific ecological niche. And then the socioeconomic factors are basically commercial ex-vessel value, commercial fishery dependence, recreational desirability, and recreational dependence. And these are calculated by the CES as a function of basically sort of the available data that we can collect on this species in terms of value and in terms of how much it's targeted in the recreational fishery or data or reported as targeted. And how much of those landings are coming from various communities within each region. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, the commercial value and the commercial community fishery dependence are rated relatively low for both regions, and recreational desirability and recreational dependence are rated higher for both regions. The one thing that we are missing from the scores right now is the socioeconomic impacts of the proposed reductions, mainly because we don't know what the proposed reductions are yet. So we need to know sort of what the scale of that cut will be in order to be able to score the overall short-term and long-term impacts to both the commercial and the recreational fisheries. And so I'll talk a little bit once we get to the end about sort of the next steps, but this will be another step that will sort of feed into this process. And so the preliminary output that I am showing today does not include this component. When we come back with the board requested analyses, it will include this component. So Initial board weightings were gathered via a survey of board members. We had 11 commissioners respond, 4 from the southern region and 7 from the northern region. So in terms of basically all of those factors that the TC and the SES scored, I am now going to tell you how important the board thought they were overall in terms of how you should consider them in management decisions. And I'm presenting a sort of histogram of the various responses from people who filled this out. This does not, some people, as you recall, perhaps if you took the survey, we did ask, what are your thoughts on the importance of this for the northern region, and what are your thoughts on the importance of this for the southern region? Some people chose not to respond for one region or the other, and so the total sample size or total number of counts for each section is not going to be the same across regions. But basically, this is the overall response from each region, as well as the average weight for each region. So as a reminder, higher weight means we're going to put more emphasis on that component, so it gets multiplied by that score, and will lead to more weight on that component within the overall function. So I'm just going to provide, in addition to the scores, some comments from board members about what they were considering when they thought about these different SSB statuses. And so what we have here on the top is whether or not stock is below the biomass threshold, how important is that? And then whether or not the stock is below the biomass target, and how important is that? And so I think what you can take away from this is that the board as a whole put more weight on whether or not you're above the biomass whether or not you are below the biomass threshold than whether or not you're below the target. And this was basically saying, people commented on things like it's important to avoid that overfished state, and red drum like history and management could make it difficult to rebuild. The lower weight, some people put a lower weight on both of these components, and saying that because of the high uncertainty in the SSB estimates and the SSB status. And in addition, people thought that it was put more weight on avoiding that overfished condition than on the target condition, mostly saying that, you know, a target is nice to achieve, but it's not that important overfished or not overfished threshold. So where you are relative to the target got a lower weight than where you are relative to the threshold. Similarly for the F status, we're seeing here the where you are relative to the F threshold on top and where you are relative to the F target on the bottom. And again, comments on it's important to avoid that overfishing status, and that the F estimates are more reliable than the SSB estimates. So some people put more weight on those than on the SSB component. And again, more weight on the overfishing, you know, where you are relative to that threshold than where you are relative to that target. So other factors in terms of model uncertainty, people were considering the data availability, including end as well as MRIP uncertainty, the potential for that cryptic SSB, that we have less of a handle on what's happening with the offshore adult population. And so overall similar results, slightly, people were putting more weight on that model uncertainty for the South than for the North. For management uncertainty, considering sort of sporadic availability in the North could mean it's harder to get data on removals as well as harder to control those removals. And so, and there's better MRIP data in the South to get a better estimate of removals, but also noted that this is a high catch and release fishery, which means, you know, management options in terms of size limits or bag limits are going to potentially have less of an effect on controlling F. And so in this case, there was higher management uncertainty in the North compared to the South, partly reflecting that sort of sporadic nature of the North versus the South catches. And again, with the environmental uncertainty, that was sort of equally weighted almost in both regions compared to some of the other factors. It's sort of right in the middle. It's mostly because people were commenting again that it's unclear what the impact will be on the stock in either region. That we know the environmental effects are potentially important and there's uncertainty here, but it's hard to say what direction that will go. And then in terms of ecosystem importance, that was weighted relatively low for both regions in people emphasizing that it's not a keystone predator. And so obviously, while it has some ecological importance, that's not going to be a major component of management decisions. And then in terms of the socioeconomics, there was sort of this is short-term effects across the top for the recreational fishery on the left and the recreational fishery or commercial fishery on the right, and then long-term effects on the bottom. And so you can see in general the recreational short-term and long-term effects were rated more highly for both regions than the commercial effects, mostly just out of consideration that the commercial fishery is an extremely small component of overall removals for both regions. And there was also, people were commenting that, again, this is a large catch and release component to the recreational fishery. So things like bag limits or size limits may actually have less of an impact on that overall fishery in terms of demand or in terms of trips for those management changes. So this is sort of the average weights of all of those factors across regions, with the north on the top and the south on the bottom. And so you can see basically that what's coming out as sort of the highest weights would be that stock status, where you are relative to the threshold and where you are for both the fishing mortality and the SSB. And then the short-term and long-term socioeconomic impacts to the recreational fishery were coming out sort of the highest. And then the lowest was that kind of ecosystem importance and the effect on the commercial fishery. So when you combine all of that together, what you're getting is, again, this probability of what should your management action achieve? How likely should you be to achieve that F target in order to take into account stock status and uncertainty and socioeconomic impacts? And so what you can see is sort of, maybe you can see this, hard to tell on this screen, is basically the negative stock status in the south and that higher uncertainty is pushing that probability into the more conservative or precautionary range. So for example, the Magnus and Stevens says you should never have a probability below 50%. That 50% is generally the starting point for our analyses. And compared to that, sort of if everything was great for the stock, if we were not overfished, if there was very low uncertainty, very low environmental impacts, et cetera, then we would be starting at 50%. The uncertainty and the stock status are pushing this probability into a more precautionary approach at this point. However, this does not include the socioeconomic criteria, which will sort of push back on that buffer. And so we will update these scores once we have an idea of the overall socioeconomic impact of trying to achieve, for example, a 68% probability of achieving that F target. The northern scores are on here. You can see that they recommend less of a buffer because the stock status is more positive in the north, that you are not overfished and not overfishing, although you have some probability of being on the wrong side of the target for both statuses. But you can see that impact of the negative stock status in the north pushing you to be more precautionary, or sorry, in the south, pushing you to be more precautionary for this region. So what's happening next? First of all, well, this can happen in any order really, but we're going to have a board discussion on weights. So we provided the survey as a way to get a starting point for what people are thinking, but that's not the final answer. The board can discuss at this meeting if they would like to adjust any of those weights, or you can wait until the tool is updated with the final socioeconomic scores and have that discussion then. Or you can do both. You can have a discussion now and you can have a discussion when you see the scores again. The TC will do the projections with the recommended probability for the south to estimate that reduction needed. The CES will then update the socioeconomic scores with that information, and that will then buffer it and recommend a different probability, and the TC will do another set of projections with that probability. The TC will has also been tasked by the board to look at some to do this the other way, of start out with some management options and calculate a reduction, and then they can provide you with the impact of that reduction on the stock and provide that relative to sort of the score so that you get an idea of how risky each of those scenarios are relative to sort of what this tool is recommending. And so again, just as a final reminder, the board is not obligated under our process to use this tool. So you can use the recommended probabilities that come out of this tool as is. You can adjust those weights to get a probability that is more consistent with your management objectives. So you can say, I want to put a higher weight on stock status and have a higher probability of achieving the S target, or I want to put a higher weight on the socioeconomic components in order and accept a lower probability in order to offset potential negative socioeconomic considerations. You can also choose another probability without the tool, but in that case, I think we would recommend that at least you explain your choices on that front. And I think this gives you sort of a framework to say, here are the things we're thinking about. And because of that, we're going to choose this probability. And so these are sort of options that you can have going forward. You don't have to make a decision at this meeting. You don't even have to provide additional input at this meeting if you don't want to. But in the end, after this whole process has gone through, we would like feedback on the tool at the end to help the policy board decide how to proceed with this tool, whether this is something we continue to use for our more data-rich species, or whether it needs to be revised or reconsidered. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
I have a couple. So because we have a northern and a southern stock, how much crossover did you see between regions?
In terms of board members?
Yes.
I didn't actually count that. We definitely had people only responded for their region, but then some people responded for all regions as well. I think probably what you should consider in this, the tool is designed to sort of elicit the considerations that you think about when you are basically voting on something. So I think if you are going to, if you would abstain from a vote on measures for one region, then you can abstain from this tool. But if you are going to vote on measures for another region, it makes sense to fill out this tool in the sense to kind of explain what you are considering when you are making those management decisions, if that helps.
Thank you. And so you said 11 commissioners filled it out of the possible one. I guess there's 13 votes, but if there's 3 commissioners, so the 39, do you see if more commissioners had filled it out, maybe there would have been a different response, or do you think was that enough?
So I would say, I think it's enough for a starting point, but I would definitely say the final decision on these weights is up to the board. And so even if you did not necessarily fill it out now, you can also see there wasn't a huge, or like a big, I guess I would say there wasn't a big difference in the weights across those different categories compared to the all equal weights. And so I think partly sometimes that is because you can see some people voted high and some people voted low, and you sort of end up back at the middle. Or in other cases, people agreed, generally on maybe a 4, and so, or close to a 3, and it wasn't that different. So I think, more input is always good, especially at the survey level, where you can sort of think about this without the influence of your fellow commissioners. But as a starting point, I think it was a relatively good response rate and range of responses.
Thank you. Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Katie, for going through this for us. I have to admit that this risk and uncertainty tool and the results that were presented today just aren't intuitive to me, so I've got lots of questions. So at the end of your presentation, you talked about the results of the risk and uncertainty tool informing reductions. Can you explain more what that means? Because in my mind, I think of reductions for buffers to be reducing attack, and in this fishery, we don't manage with attack. So what do you mean by reductions?
So, right, in this case, as you said, we don't have attack. We have instead those management bag and size limit options. And so the example I think would be, and I'm going to say right up front, I'm just making up numbers here. I'm not part of the red drum assessment, so I have no idea where these numbers are coming from. And so I don't want to imply in any way that, for example, let's say the projections say, in order to have a 50% probability of achieving F target, you need 20% lower removals next year in order to be at the F target compared to where you are at the end of the assessment. So in that case, generally what we would do would be to go through and say, okay, to get a 20% reduction in removals, we need to go from a slot limit of X to Y to, we're going to come down an inch, or we're going to change the bag and size limit, we're going to change the bag limit, we're going to adjust that slot limit, and we predict that that will give us a 20% reduction in removals. And so that is where, that's your sort of starting point. And in that case, I think you could then say, well, what is the the socioeconomic impact of that size limit change or that bag limit change? Maybe it's negligible. Maybe for a predominantly catch and release fishery, the socioeconomic impact is small and people will still be taking those trips, or, they'll just be focused on the catch and release component. In that case, if the impact is small, then you won't need to take a smaller reduction, essentially, so that you would say maybe we'd stay at the 20%, or maybe we would take an 18% reduction instead. Versus if you look at the potential management change and say, this is going to have a big impact on the fishery. For example, we definitely get a lot of impact or comments on striped bass about pushing that minimum size limit up is going to impact the shore fishery. It's going to impact the for-hire fishery. There's going to be negative socioeconomic consequences to this proposed management change. In that case, if there's a big impact, you can say, we're going to, instead of taking that big 20% reduction, we'll maybe aim for a 15% reduction. Maybe that means your slot limit doesn't go down quite so far. Or maybe your vessel limit doesn't change quite so much. And we'll take a lower reduction, which will have a lower probability of achieving that F target. So it's slightly more risky, but it lets us offset some of that negative socioeconomic impact in the final management actions. Does that help?
Somewhat. So you're talking about reducing or adding to the likelihood of achieving your target.
Both of them are connected. So we're looking at the percent reduction that you're going to strive to achieve, because again, we're not setting a TAC. We're just saying we're going to pick a set of management options that the TC feels is likely to produce this level of a reduction. And so that's essentially that's almost like your TAC. We don't think of it as a TAC, but that is essentially the TC is saying this level of removals is what we need to hit in order to have the acceptable probability of achieving that F target. And so that's going to be some level lower than we were in the last year of the assessment. And so that's where the reduction comes into. And then if you take a lower reduction, that translates through into less restrictive management, but then it also translates through into a lower probability of achieving your F target, because you're taking less of a cut than your initial probability would suggest you need to. I don't know if this is necessarily translating through.
Okay, Ben?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in the presentation that we were given a week ago, I remember on the graph, or the graph table, if you will, it had a big arrow on the left-hand side that kind of came back up, and it was kind of explained that this might be a fluid process. And you mentioned that, I kind of think you alluded to it. So what I'm getting at is we can project or assume as managers what the impacts might be socioeconomically, but once we really realize what we get those projections back, how that really is going to affect them socioeconomically, depending on what the different options might be. So in those discussions as we move forward, once we get those projections, are we able to come back and kind of reweight this to some degree, if you will? I don't know if I'm using the right terms or not, but then if we choose to use this management tool, once we see those, we can then set a different level if we so choose.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, we recognize that, number one, this is still being pilot tested, and so this is brand new to everybody. And then number two, we recognize that it's not super intuitive to say, I put a 3 here, and now I have to have a 60% probability of achieving F target. And so there is definitely, we want the board to have the ability to go through and basically have this conversation about, okay, now that I've seen what happens if we try to achieve a 60% probability, I'm not comfortable with that. I want to push back. Either I don't think this is conservative enough, or I think this is too conservative. And so I want to adjust what factors are, I'm putting a higher weight on stock status, which would become more precautionary, or I'm putting a higher weight on socioeconomic inputs, which would mean it's less precautionary. And so for sure, there is points as we come back and tell you guys about, okay, here's the potential impact of this probability, you guys have the ability to adjust that so that what comes out in the end is a number that you're comfortable with. We're not trying to, I think, force you guys to pick a number that you're not comfortable with. Instead, we want to have the conversation about, why did you pick this number? Like, I think a lot of times, part of the impetus for this tool was that, the TC does a bunch of these numbers, it throws a bunch of numbers up on the screen, and the board is like, I pick that option. Option B, that's the one I'm going to go for. And it's like, well, why option B and not option C or D? And so I think part of this is trying to get at the conversation about, why are you being more risky, or why are you being more precautionary, in a way that, trying to articulate that discussion for the board itself and then for the public, and just create more transparency around that process. So we don't want to lock you into a specific number that you're not comfortable with. We just want you guys to maybe articulate more clearly and transparently what number you are comfortable with and what factors went into that decision, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. That was a perfect answer. Thank you. I appreciate it. And follow up to that is, if we're getting potential projections on a southern regional scale, and then also maybe state by state. So if it ends up being a state by state path that we go down, can we use this tool on a state by state basis?
So yes, I would say, I think you're kind of still going to be, the reductions will happen on the state by state basis, and then you're going to sort of pool up to the whole stock unit. So we won't be saying, in South Carolina, your probability of achieving the F target is this. Instead, we'll be saying, with the reductions, and I should probably be looking at Jeff and Joey to make eye contact, but my vision is that we will instead be saying, here, the reduction in South Carolina will achieve this, combined with the reduction in Georgia, combined with the reduction in Florida. Overall, for the southern region, your total reduction will be Y, and this is the probability of achieving F target for that stock. And then I think you can look and say, similarly, this has too much of an impact in South Carolina, so we're going to try to kind of adjust for a lower reduction, have a larger buffer or a smaller buffer on that reduction, and then pool that back up again, so that you can look at sort of, in each state, you can consider what is the what happens if you make that reduction larger or smaller, and then translate that back up to the regional population and say, what is the effect of that combination of reductions, or in achieving that regional F target.
Perfect, thank you.
Any other questions? Ben, go ahead.
Sorry. And just for clarity, and this is separate from the last couple questions, but you did say in the report, in those presentations, the Southeast socioeconomic responses were not included. So all those socioeconomic responses we saw were from the northern region. Is that correct?
So it's what is happening is sort of there's two components for the socioeconomic, which is how important is it to the community? What are your landings? And that is sort of, I guess I would say, relatively constant. We can calculate that right now. Then the next component is, what is the impact of the management change that you're going to produce? And so we don't know what the management action will be at this point. So we can instead, when the TC runs through their various options and says, okay, here's the options for size limits, here's the options for the bag limit for the South, then we can talk to the socioeconomic committee and say, what is the impact of that proposed management change on the community? And that score is empty right now, and that will be filled in as part of this process. And that's really the part that sort of buffers that more precautionary component, or I guess reduces the buffer on the precautionary component.
Anyone else? John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just briefly, Katie, you've probably gone over this before. The minimum is still 50%, right? So that is like a baseline, or could it go below 50%?
It can go below 50%. We do not, the tool is currently set up to not require that. And so I think it's up to the board to consider, what is the lower minimum that you're comfortable with? And that can be part of the discussion, but we, unlike the Magnuson-Stevens Act, do not specify a lower bound on that, for good or for ill.
Okay, good discussion. I think we'll probably see it again, have some more discussion once we get some results back from the TC. Oh, wait, no, Erica.
So I was holding discussion until after questions. Are we going to have discussion?
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
All right. So I mentioned that parts of this were not intuitive to me. And one of the parts is the responses from the survey. We started a discussion when the presentation was given to the board about how to use the risk and uncertainty tool and what we should be thinking about as we provided our responses. And we discussed whether it was appropriate for states and representatives from states outside of the stocks region to provide inputs on the other region. And would we know enough about the stock and the region to be able to answer these questions? And I think this first round of results really showed us that there's a problem with that. So if you go to the slide that showed the importance of the commercial fishery, there were responses weighting the importance of the commercial fishery and the southern stock as having a value. We also saw in the TC, or the technical inputs, that there was a value of the commercial stock in this risk uncertainty tool. So that's like a basis. Yet we have no commercial fishery in the southern stock. So that invalidates all of the responses, considering we had, to me, that's my interpretation, we had 4 responses from the South, yet when we get to responses like SSB, et cetera, there are 11 responses on the southern stock. That means 5 commissioners from outside of the southern stock weighed in to give the importance of SSB. We just had the stock assessment chair say that the value of SSB for this stock is not as meaningful as F, yet SSB was rated really high based on commissioner inputs. Intuitively, the results of what we were presented here today don't make sense to how it would be informative to management or would support management decisions to me about this stock and this fishery. So at a minimum, next time we review this, I'd like to see the results broken out with commissioners' responses for the South being the risk and uncertainty tool that the southern stock would be considering, and the responses from commissioners for the North being what they would consider for their management.
I mean, we can absolutely provide that broken out. But I guess I would also look to the board to say, is it the expectation of the board that the South will not vote on Northern management action and the North will not vote on the Southern management action, or not? Is the entire board voting on management action for each region? And I don't know. I think that's up to the board, and that's I think it's just a matter of of where you're voting and where you're abstaining would influence, how those scores are calculated. I mean, we can definitely provide both options for this, but I think the reason we opened it to both regions is that we have the expectation that members from both regions will be voting on both regions. But if that's not the case, then we can adapt the tool and the responses accordingly.
Thoughts on that? Spud?
Yeah, I think what confounded this is I think some respondents self-chose to NA and others didn't. So you don't have any uniformity in the way people are engaging themselves in this. And I think that is a fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves is, how are we going to do that? Because I think there is a sensitivity that, especially in a situation where we've got such a dichotomy here in the stock status results, you know, we've got obviously the need to take measures to reduce fishing mortality in the south, not necessarily in the north, even though, you know, as Chris was saying, there may be some discussion of sort of voluntarily taking actions. But I think when we get down to actually doing it, I would personally think that the region that's being affected should be the one who has the input on their fate. And that's just, you know, that's the way I look at it. And so I think it's important if we're going to use this tool that we have standard rules of engagement so that we know who is engaging and how they're engaging on this.
Is there anyone on the opposite side of that? Chris Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is sounding like an issue much bigger than Red Drum or Scienids Board, because that's really not how any other management board operates at ASMFC, thinking about summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, where we have regional management and all the member states vote on that. Striped bass to a certain extent, where we had different management measures. So I don't know if we're prepared to set the rules of engagement for who is allowed to vote on what for this particular species and board, because this goes kind of beyond what I envisioned we were supposed to do at ASMFC. But I'll leave that to others as far as what they think. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that as we get towards tomorrow morning and maybe policy, that we'll begin a discussion on that topic that may run a few meetings. Any other thoughts from? Yes, ma'am. Sorry, Carrie.
Yeah, Carrie Kennedy from Maryland. So I think I hear your concern. As Maryland, I did provide my thoughts on risk and uncertainty on the southern stock. I did rank those, but I will say that I felt like I didn't know enough or have enough information, and I felt like it was more important and appropriate that the southern states weighted or got to have more weight in the socioeconomic information. But I do see this as a guide and not something that we're held to. And because we had an opportunity to comment on what was motivating us, I took the time to provide those comments. But because unlike the councils that are, you know, mandated to follow these things, and we aren't, I felt like it was a good sort of way to take the temperature of what the administrative commissioners are thinking without binding us to act in any particular way or another.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else? Crickets. Okay. Yes, sir. Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I appreciate Chris's comments, and another example of a management plan that has states voting where they have a de minimis interest in the fishery is Atlantic Menhaden. So, I mean, I think this is just the way this place operates. So I don't know why we would go down the road where only certain commissioners that are part of a board would be able to have a vote where other ones wouldn't. It doesn't really make any sense to me. Thank you.
Roy.
Just to follow up on what Jeff said and Chris said, we're flirting with changing our procedures here. And I want to make sure we do this mindfully. Many of the species that the state of Delaware votes on represent minimal contributions to our sport or commercial fisheries, and yet our vote counts. Are we proposing that only those states within the prime region of a particular species, only those votes should count? I'm just a little concerned about changing our procedure that we've historically used, but without giving it a lot of thought. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think a lot of thought is to come. I mean, I think this is a discussion is going to come, but the actions of another species board at the last meeting really brought all this to light, where there were states that had relatively no fishery, but yet were on the board, made decisions that affected other areas, right? And so that's what's opened this can, and I think we need a lot of discussion about this, but I don't think anything we're going to do today is going to affect that, right? There's a lot of us probably that have a lot of a lesson or of a commission history, and so perhaps we need a little history lesson on where things have been, and we need to look at things like declared interests and whether states that have declared it, how are you declared, and should those who are on a board but don't have declared interest vote on an issue, right? So all of that, I think we'll start that discussion tomorrow and see where it goes from there. Dave, you had a comment? No? Mel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I appreciate Jeff and Chris's comments, but I think that with this particular example, we're dealing with two separate stocks, two separate, the assessment with two different stocks. So with Menhaden, it's one stock. You do have states that de minimis vote, obviously, but in this case, and the point that Erica made about the commercial, we have no commercial, fishery. So our, folks commenting on that do have commercial options, commenting on that, it just kind of confuses things a little bit in the score, how you might weight things. But it's, the two different stocks in this case. Whereas in other cases, it's one coastwide stock that we manage. So I think that's why it's a little more sensitive right now in terms of developing this tool and the use of the tool and who comments on or provides input for the scores on the tool.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mel, you kind of went where I was going. There's a discussion of regional management where you're splitting up a single stock, but we're talking about different stocks here. And I understand why it might be difficult for folks to separate the two arguments, but specific to this tool is where I'd like to stay in this board meeting, because I think the other conversations are better fit for another venue. We have this tool that is supposed to inform risk and uncertainty and how we weight it. Yet we have people who are uninformed providing information into risk and uncertainty, because if you were informed on the southern stock, you would know that there was no commercial fishery. So it's kind of like junk in, junk out. And I'd prefer to have informed opinions guiding risk and uncertainty versus guesses. And I too, Carrie, did respond to the North and provided those justifications because I thought it would provide a good way for us to look at and talk about, okay, if someone outside the stock is commenting on what it might be up there, I said why I made those references. And I think it'd be really interesting to look at. So is the outsider perspective similar to those who responded within the state? Is it different? I think that would provide value to the tool itself and how it's used in the future. But for the purpose of this, where we're looking at risk and uncertainty at the stock level, weighting a commercial fishery is important in a place where it doesn't exist. That is meaningless.
I think, and so in that case, right, then when there is no commercial fishery, then that part of the score will get zeroed out. So I think because we're looking at sort of two separate components, which is number one, how important is it? How risky how uncertain is the assessment? What is the stock status? And then the separate component is when you're thinking about a management decision, how do these play out? So you can say, I think it's, I think considering the commercial importance is as important as considering the recreational importance, like the weights are equal, but because there is no commercial fishery, that gets zeroed out, and sort of the only component then that's part of it is the recreational component. So there is that aspect of it. However, there's also the aspect of, I would like to even downweight that even further. So maybe there's a very small commercial component in the north, for example, but we would say, you know, because it's a smaller component, the economic impact of management action on that fishery is going to get downweighted further through our weightings versus considering it equal to the recreational component. So I think we can definitely, you know, I think this is a good conversation to have in terms of like how we are thinking about and presenting this information. And for the next round, we can definitely provide sort of, you know, here's the northern people's scores on these two regions, and here's the southern representative scores on these two regions, and are there differences? I mean, obviously we only got like 4 responses from the southern region, so it's a little bit of, you know, the sample size is low, but again, these are, you know, the survey is just the starting point. And so if we're looking at this, then I think the board has the option to consider, we would like to hear more about, you know, we will change our weightings to better match the other region because we think that's what's important. But if we're all voting, if everybody is voting on both regions, then presumably there is some sort of mental consideration of those different factors going into that vote in the end that we would like to try to capture and articulate, as opposed to just a mystery black box process that leads to the final vote. But I think these are, you know, definitely good things to consider as we develop this tool and how this tool is presented and used going forward.
Thank you. So good discussion on the tool, good questions, and I think a good primer for later on in the week. So thank you. Keeping us on track. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is considering an annual update to black drum indicators. And Harry Rickabaugh from Maryland. All right.
Yes.
From Maryland. Thank you, Katie. Dr. Drew. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Harry Rickabaugh from Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I'm the current Black Drum TC chair. I'm going to give you the update for the indicators. I'm going to go over a couple of slides just to give the background real quick of what we're doing and how we got here. So following the 2023 assessment, the black drum stock was determined to be not overfished and overfishing was not occurring. And that was through 2020, which was the terminal year of the assessment. During that assessment, indicators were identified that could be used to monitor the stock in between assessments. And during that time, those indicators did not appear to be overall negative. There was a lack of contrast in the black drum data sets, coupled with the high uncertainty in the model base estimates. Due to that factor, the TC recommend monitoring those empirical stock indicators annually between assessments, and the board agreed to annually monitoring those as a trigger-only assessment. So these don't trigger management action. It only would trigger an updated assessment. Currently, the assessment is scheduled to be done in 2027, but should we see a negative trend, the TC can recommend expediting that assessment. So the indicators are divided into basically 3 categories. And within those 3 categories, many of them are divided into 2 regions. There's the Mid-Atlantic region, which is Virginia North, and the Southern region, which is North Carolina South. So for the abundance indices, the Mid-Atlantic region only has YOY indices. So just for young of the year, there are no adult indices or sub-adult indices in the Mid-Atlantic. For the South Atlantic, there is a YOY indice, an age 0 to 1 combined indice, and a sub-adult indice. Then we also have a coastwide exploitable abundance metric as well, and that is based on the MRIP CPUE that we developed. The next category is the range expansion indicator, and that is not used as an overall stock abundance indicator. That is just to see if the species is using the northern part of its range more frequently than it has historically. And then finally, we have the fishery catch information, which is basically the recreational live releases, recreational harvest, and commercial landings. And those are again structured by region. So we had the first data update last year, which was data added on for 2021 and 2022 past the last assessment. Those showed mixed signs of stability and declines, but overall the TC was not concerned, did not recommend to change the assessment schedule at that time. The Sciaenids board at the last meeting also did request the TC consider the frequency of these updates, whether they need to be annual or on a longer time frame, considering the long lifespan of the species. Currently, this update will only have one additional year of data. That's the 2023 data. And for each of these figures I'm going to be showing moving forward, all of them will have a dashed line across them. That's going to be the time series mean. The abundance indicators will all be structured as the ones you see, like the ones you see here, which are standardized to their mean. So these are not the actual index values. They're standardized to the mean, so we can see the trend between the indices on the same scale. All the graphs are going to have these black dots connected by the black lines. Those are the data that was available during the last assessment. And the red dots with the red lines will be the data that's being added since the last assessment. For the Mid-Atlantic region, which is what's currently on the screen, these are all, again, young of the year indices. And you can see that they're basically varied around their time series mean, with the top two panels and the lower left panel being from the Delaware Bay region. Those were lowest in, or below, I'm sorry, their time series mean in 2021 and 2023, but above their time series mean in 2022. The lower right panel is the Maryland Coastal Bays Seine survey, and that has the reverse trend of being above the time series mean in 2021 and 2023, and below the time series mean in 2022. The next slide here has the South Atlantic abundance indices. And for this, again, there are one of each juvenile, an age 0 and 1, and a subadult. All of these were below their time series mean in 2023. Two of these indicators did increase, though, throughout the update period. Those are the 0 and 1 abundance and the YY index, with one on the left side of your screen and one on the right side of your screen. The subadult index was above its time series mean in 2021, but fell to just below its time series mean and was pretty stable in 2022 and 2023. The next indicator is the exploitable abundance indicator. And again, this is the MRIP CPUE. During the assessment time period, again in black, you can see it generally increased, kind of stabilized near the end of the time period. And then we saw a decline to below the mean in 2021. Since then, it has increased, and the 2023 value was above the time series mean and approaching the value of the terminal year of the assessment. And again, this is the only index that is used in the model. Now we're moving to the range expansion indicator, and it was not available in 2021. You can see the 2022 and 2023 values were very similar and below the mean. So this seems to indicate that the young of the year black drum are not currently using the northern region any more than they have kind of earlier in the time series. We did have some spikes in the middle of the area, or middle of the time series, excuse me, and we'll continue to monitor this obviously into the future. And now we're going to move on to the catch information. These are not standardized to their mean. So this particular one's live releases, and it is in numbers of fish. So you can see the scale between the northern region and the southern region. Southern region catches a greater number of fish than the northern region. And they varied around their time series mean in the mid-Atlantic. It was slightly below the time series mean in 2023. And the figure there looks like it's right on the line. It was just below the time series mean in the terminal year. And the South Atlantic remained above the time series mean for all update years. It did increase for the first time in 5 years in 2023. We were seeing a declining trend in recreational releases in the South Atlantic. That did reverse in 2023, and that point is above the terminal point of the assessment. And then we have recreational harvest. This one is in millions of pounds. And again, the South Atlantic, even by weight, catches more fish, or there's a larger harvest in pounds than in the Mid-Atlantic. Just as a reminder, the Mid-Atlantic predominantly targets larger adult fish, and the South Atlantic subadult fish. So the recreational harvest has varied slightly during the update years. They've been pretty stable for both regions, with all the update years being below the time series mean and the levels at the terminal year of the assessment for the Mid-Atlantic, and all 3 years being above the time series mean and the level of terminal year of the assessment for the South Atlantic. And then for the last figure I have here, we have the commercial landings. These are in thousands of pounds, so a lower level of landings than the recreational harvest. And they are more equal between the two regions in weight. And the commercial landings have a similar pattern to recreational landings, with the Mid-Atlantic all 3 years being below the time series mean, and with the South Atlantic all 3 years being above the time series mean. And the terminal year 2023 value for the South Atlantic was a market increase. It's the highest value since 2008. So overall, the indicator showed similar conditions to the terminal year of the assessment, with some signs of increases in the South Atlantic. The increases in catch in the South Atlantic are likely driven by increases in effort and targeting in the South Atlantic region, particularly in the recreational fishery. TC members from the South Atlantic said they believe this was due to increased targeting effort being shifted from other recreational species that have had more regulations put on recently, particularly summer flounder. There was some TC concern in the southern region over these increases as to whether they're positive. In other words, is it an increase in abundance or is it an increase in effort? And we don't have the information to really tease that out, but there's a little bit of concern there, something we need to watch moving into the future. The decreased commercial landings in the Mid-Atlantic are primarily due to market demand. There's been a reduced effort in that commercial fishery, particularly in Delaware Bay. Delaware has also lost a lot of its aging capability because they were aging from the commercial fishery. So since that effort has dropped, they've been unable to collect the age samples they have in the past. So the overall recommendation from the TC is not to have an advanced timeline for the stock assessment. They did discuss the board's request to decide whether this needs to be an annual update or we can do it on a more longer time frame. And we also discussed how we probably wouldn't want to do an update the year before an assessment, because the assessment's basically going to get triggered for the next year anyway. So we'd be starting that assessment, and we'd also be probably beginning to gather data for the assessment, so then put time and energy into update. We would prefer not to do it the year before an assessment is already scheduled. And the TC is recommending, the last two bullets are kind of combined, that we don't do the next update until 2026. So we'll wait for an additional 2 years of data. And then we will push the stock assessment back 1 year to 2028. And that will allow us, the TC discussed this quite a bit, but even though the MRIP data should be available for the 2027 assessment, we really wanted to make sure that was available for this species. It's primarily a recreational species. It's also likely to have no new data streams. We still will be dependent for our adult / exploitable biomass index being a MRIP index, because there's no other fishery independent indices on the adult stock. So since we're so reliant on that data, we would like to have the most recent updates available. So to ensure that's going to happen, we would like to push that back to 2028. And with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Harry. Any questions for Harry? Well, very good. So is there any discussion or input for them regarding their recommendations? I don't think we need a motion, but General Chris Bat-Savage.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I support the TC's recommendations to just do the data updates every 2 years and move the stock assessment back on the schedule. So we're not working on two things at once, but I think it makes a lot of sense since this is largely a recreational fishery to ensure that the newly recalibrated catch estimates from MRIP are available and online, so those could be used in the assessment. Moving it back a year, I think this increases the chances of that data being ready in time for the model, if I understand the TC's recommendation correctly.
Yes, thank you for that affirmation. Anyone else? Okay, well, I think we can accept the TC's recommendations, and thank you very much, Eric. All right, next agenda item is consideration of the black drum and spotted sea trout fishery management plan reviews and state compliance reports for 2023. And Tracy, this is you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'll be really briefly going through the FMP reviews for both of the species, and I can take questions at the end, I think, and then look to motions at the very end once I finish. So I'll be starting off with black drum, but I will just be sticking to the PRT recommendations because of our previous agenda item. So the PRT found no inconsistencies among states with regard to the FMP requirements, and black drum had no de minimis requests, I think as usual. Thus, the PRT simply recommends the approval of the state compliance reports. And additional research and monitoring recommendations, as always, can be found in the 2023 black drum assessment and peer review report. So moving on to spotted sea trout. So spotted sea trout is currently managed under the omnibus amendment to the Spanish mackerel spot and spotted sea trout FMPs. And that just put into place that 12-inch total length minimum size limit and comparable mesh size requirements, along with establishing adaptive management. So in regards to stock status, as a reminder, there's no coastwide assessment of spotted sea trout, and the PRT has not recommended one due to the life history of the species and the availability of data. But there is that the 2019 Florida spotted sea trout stock assessment update in recent years, and the 2022 North Carolina spotted sea trout stock assessment. And for Florida, I believe they're in the middle of working on a benchmark stock assessment, which should be completed by the end of this year. And North Carolina is currently in process of reviewing the spotted sea trout FMP there in that state. And Amendment 1 should be completed within the next year or so as well. So really brief summary of the status of the fishery, starting with an overview of the commercial and recreational harvest. This figure shows coastwide recreational and commercial spotted sea trout harvest by year in millions of pounds, with the blue bars being commercial harvest and the green bars being recreational harvest. So in the last 10 years, from 2014 to 2023, commercial landings averaged approximately 450,000 pounds. And in 2023, commercial landings totaled 522,000 pounds, which was a 31% decrease from a previous peak in 2021. Recreational harvest is generally without trend through the time series. From 2019 through 2022, recreational harvest was relatively high, averaging about 6.6 million pounds or 3.9 million fish. However, recreational harvest in 2023 declined by approximately 40% from this average to about 4.3 million pounds or 2.4 million fish. I will now move on to just a little more information on specifically the recreational fishery. This figure compares recreational catch, harvest, and releases in millions of fish from 1981 through 2023. And over the last 42 years or so, recreational catch of spotted sea trout kept and released has shown an upward trend, increasing from about 4 million fish in 1981 to over 31 million fish in 2018, as it remained high through 2022. But in 2023, similar trend, recreational catch declined by 37% from the previous year. to 16 million fish, which is the lowest recreational catch since 2008. The number of fish released has averaged about 19 million fish in the last 10 years. In 2023, about 14 million fish were released, which is a 38% decline from the previous year. So moving on to PRT recommendations. Once again, the PRT found no inconsistencies among states with regard to the F&P requirements and recommended approval of state compliance reports and de minimis status for New Jersey and Delaware. Let's see, yeah, and additional research and monitoring recommendations can also be found in the F&P review document. So I think with that, I can take any questions.
Questions on the FMP, the reviews for Tracy? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion to accept? Someone like to read it, Spud?
Put it back up, please. My memory's not that good. There we go. Thank you. Move.
And Spud, just so you're not surprised, I was planning on doing two separate motions for the two different species.
Okay.
I think that's the real one, Spud.
Not the real one? Okay. Move to approve the Black Drum FMP review and state compliance reports for the 2023 fishing year.
And we got Malcolm with a second. Discussion? Opposition? Abstentions? Motion carries by unanimous consent. Okay, and a second motion?
All right, move to approve the Spotted Sea Trout FMP review for the 2023 fishing year, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for New Jersey and Delaware.
Okay, and Joe Semino with a second. Any discussion? Any opposition? Abstentions? Seeing none, that motion also carries. All right, thank you very much. I didn't hear any other business when we started this meeting. So I think that concludes the business of this board. Is there a motion for adjournment? I hear one. Is there a second? I see one. We are adjourned. Thank you.